They're not wrong. This is what faith is. It's just not Christian faith. And that's what we want to discuss today. So, in light of this, we just need to sort of recognize that when people hear us talking about faith, they will often be thinking of these kinds of definitions of faith. And we should be very aware of that in this day and age. Okay, so what I want to do first off is sort of trace, how did we get here? How is it that faith has become known this way? And then also, how do we recover what true faith is? First of all, there's a fascinating scholar by the name of Mortimer Adler. Some of you may be familiar with his work. He was really big in the great books in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And he said that, I suspect that most of those who have religious faith are content with blind faith. They feel no obligation to understand what they believe. They may even wish not to have their beliefs disturbed by a thought. But if the God in whom they believe created them with intellectual and rational powers, that imposes upon them the duty to try to understand what the creed of their faith, to try to understand the creed of their religion. Not to do so is to verge on superstition. See, what happens is you have a community of the faithful, and at some point, you stop having to justify your view because you're in the community of the doctrinal, your camp. And so you don't have to ask too many questions in that kind of a world. Well, when the Christian religion came on the scene and it converted a lot of Druids and pagans and Picts and the Gauls and all the different territories, country after country, Christianity introduced itself to the West. You had to have an argument because your own family members thought you were crazy. You believe in a Jewish guy that was crucified? He's God? You're God? We actually have ancient depictions on walls of slave quarters of fellow slaves making fun of their Christian slaves. One of them depicts a crucified individual with a donkey head. And it says, Alexamenos worships his God. And it's Alexamenos praying to a crucified donkey figure. In those days, being an ass was a butt of a joke, just as it is today. It was a silly and crazy thing, and yet it did somehow take over country after country after country. Somehow, Christianity persuaded millions and millions of people. It became the number one religion in the world. But at some point in the Christian West, we forgot how to do that because everybody was a Christian already. And we just sort of came up with other ideas and views about what faith is and how we cultivate it. I myself was raised Jewish. But I was an atheist by the third grade because I thought religion was a joke. And it wasn't until I discovered the text of the Old Testament, which talked about a Messiah who was going to be born in Bethlehem, who would die, and who would be, whose religion would, become a light to the Gentiles. I started reading this in the text and talking to rabbis about it. I was convinced that it was true, even though it was awkward with family members and friends. And so ever since then, I've been fascinated by the epistemology of faith. How do you know what you know? How do I know what I know about faith and about Christianity? Well, I'm persuaded that it's true, not because of a feeling, although I did have a lot of Christians early on tell me about this. I was persuaded because I think the God of history revealed himself. He revealed himself in history and before he came. He revealed himself in countless ways through the Old Testament, announcing what he would do when he did arrive. Well, so this idea that faith, so Mortimer Adler was saying that faith is kind of, blind faith is very common with religious people, but that word blind faith is a way to identify what faith is. It's a kind of faith without looking where you're going. It's just jumping. The question I have been asking on my podcast is, why have you jumped here? Why have you made this particular faith conviction? Why the Bible, not the Quran or the Book of Mormon? Why Christianity, not Islam? And often when I ask Christians this, they say things like, wow, I don't know. It's just a gut feeling. I just know in my heart it's true. Of course, a lot of other religions do too. I mean, this is the whole point about Mormonism. You know it's true because of the burning in your bosom. And so the question we have to ask is like, do Mormon hearts burn at a higher centigrade than Christian experiences? Well, that's you laugh because that is a real question. How do you engage with that issue, the experience? You've got different people have different experiences. So, and we can't all be right. Well, there were older definitions of faith in the scientific world. So contemporary and older scientists, Max Planck is one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. And so I was reading his book just less than a year ago, one of his books, and he talks about the faith being really important because you sort of understand there are assumptions that go into science. And you can't have science without faith. And he even says the inscription on the gate of the temple of science that, by which people may enter is this line, you must have faith. Paul Davies is a scientist at the University of Arizona, physicist, and he says, science has its own faith-based system. This was an op-ed in the New York Times. All science proceeds on the assumption that nature is ordered in a rational and intelligible way. You can't be a scientist if you thought the universe was a meaningless jumble of odds and ends haphazardly juxtaposed. You're going to need to have faith that tomorrow the law of gravity will be the same as it is today if you're going to do science. How do you know the law of gravity is going to be the same? Well, the Christian West applied this sort of view, these assumptions about a rational understanding of the world. It's not chaotic. It's not partly because of, we were convinced that there is a God who ordered it and also ordered our minds. And that changed the world. That's one of the reasons. There's a scholar by the name of Stanley Jaki, who says there were stillbirths in science until the Christian West. That's when science had a real, actual birth that lasted, partly because of the view of the world. Well, okay, so this relates to the older view, which has sort of been modified and changed, which we'll get into. So let's talk about the words which appear in our New Testament. The word for faith in the New Testament is pistuo. And this particular word isn't a word that was invented by religious people. It wasn't invented by Christians. The word existed before Paul and Peter and others used it. And I think today we tend to think of faith as a religious word. And that's partly because it has become used in that religious way more often than not. Although you do still hear people referring to a good faith promise or fidelity in marriage. That's the Latin version. Well, so what I wanted to do is look at how did people use this Greek word outside the New Testament. So Aristotle, for example. Aristotle used this word when he said, true theories are the most valuable for conduct as well as for science. They harmonize with the facts and they carry conviction. That word conviction is the word pistuo there. Conviction, believability, credibility. That's not the way we think of faith today. Because we think of faith today as that leap. The evidence is one thing, and then faith is the leap when you don't have evidence. And he's using it in this, it's the credibility, it's the confidence. Fide is part of confidence. We'll get into that too. So here's the definition from the biggest Greek lexicon around, the BDAG. To consider something to be true and therefore worthy of someone's trust. Okay, so you can't just have a leap without knowing anything. You trust in something or someone who's worthy of your trust. How many have had babysitters in your life, ever? Okay, some of you have had babysitters. Did you ever have a babysitter come to your house who you knew nothing about? Say, please take care of my children. Person I just got on the bus stop. Nobody has done that. Weird. You didn't have faith in the person because you knew nothing about them. But those of you who have had babysitters, you thought they were worthy of your trust, right? How about a financial advisor? Anybody give money to the guy at the bus stop who's hearing voices saying, I'm going to invest your money well? Nobody's done that. Okay, same thing. the person who's worthy of your trust gets to give you advice about your money. Now think about this. When you think about Aristotle and his idea of confidence and conviction, think about John here. This is the beginning of Jesus' signs, which Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. What did he do at Cana in Galilee? Who remembers the miracle at Cana? Water into wine. Okay, so this sign is which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. They didn't take a blind leap. They saw something. People often say faith is blind. Well, this doesn't look like it's blind. They saw him turn water into wine, and they believed in him as a result. So they saw that he wasn't your ordinary rabbi. This is the kind of rabbi that makes the party go really, really well. And so they believed in him. They put their trust in him. There's another related word here, pistao. It's very close. It's a slightly different word. It's also used in the New Testament, and it's also used by people like Josephus. The definition of this verb is to establish or confirm something, to be convinced. So again, if you think of the blind leap, there's no convincing there. This is just I don't know, I have to risk it and jump. But to be convinced, well, that sounds more like you're evaluating evidence. Josephus says this, using this verb: I have demonstrated our antiquity and confirmed the truth of what I have said from the writings of the Phoenicians and the Chaldeans. Notice what he's doing. He's looking at the writings and he's confirming them. So it's not apart from evidence. It's not blind. It's actually evidential. There are evidential considerations. And he is confirming the truths of these ideas. He's demonstrating this to be true. Paul, continue in the things you have learned and become convinced of, knowing from whom you have learned them. So this is convinced, knowing from whom you've learned. The men are trustworthy people. Now, here's the noun form, pistis. That which evokes trust and faith. So a guy in the first century named Strabo wrote a book called Geography. It was one of the earliest geography books, so he just called it Geography. And he writes, this investigation confirms us the more in our belief. Their faith is just belief. It's a noun. Well, it was the result of an investigation. So this is the word that the New Testament writers are using. They're using this word. They could have used a lot of other words, which we'll get into. They could have used hope or wish or speculation. These words are in the New Testament. They didn't use those words to talk about faith. They used this word. The one that sounds more like confidence. Basically, a good, simple definition for the kind of faith that we mean is the word trust. And the word trust is less religious. And so I recommend if you're familiar with the apologist Greg Koukl, I recommend that when you're talking to non-Christians, you consider using the word trust rather than faith. Because when you use the word faith, it often conveys religious sensibilities that I don't have, the non-Christian. I know this for a fact because I used to think like a non-Christian. So instead use trust, because we put our faith in Christ and in the Bible because we trust that it's true. It's not a leap of faith, not blind faith. There's an element of trust, and it's a reasonable trust. All right, now, just some examples of where I'm going here. So here is a story in the Gospel of Mark. You guys are familiar with this. This is the story in which 4 men lower a paralyzed man down from the roof into the home in which Jesus is speaking. And when Jesus sees their faith, he says to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the Jewish religious leaders there, they're thinking in their hearts, this man's blasphemy. No one can forgive sins but God alone. And Jesus knows their thoughts and says to them, "Why do you question these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or 'Rise, take up your bed and walk'? But so that you may know." That's a very interesting word. A lot of us don't connect with faith. Is faith knowledge? Here, Jesus is saying, so that you may know that the Son of Man has the authority. So that you may know, get in touch with your inner inner child, or pay attention to your inner gut feelings. No. So that you may know the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins, he says to the paralytic, rise up and walk. And he rose up and immediately picked up his bed and went out before them all. And many of those people there believed in Jesus as a result. They saw that faith isn't by sight. There are Bible passages about this. Yeah, we'll get into those texts. But the thing you should pay attention to here is, in addition to there being some texts about faith not being seen, there are also some texts which definitely show that faith comes as a result of seeing. And we definitely will be getting into this when we talk about eyewitness testimony, which is a big part of the New Testament. But let's go back to the beginning of the story. Okay, the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus starts with, Moses goes to he gets this vision at the burning bush. And basically he says, God, you want me to go and tell the people of Israel that I was talking to a bush, and you're going to liberate them. I don't think they're going to believe me. And what does God say? He says, don't worry. I'm going to give them a burning in their bosom. It'll be great. Doesn't say that. He doesn't say a lot of things we would expect. The kind of religious schmaltzy stuff that it's so popular. Whatever your religious tradition. What he says is, I will give them a sign. If they don't believe that, I'll give them another sign. If they don't believe that, I'll give them another sign. You get to the end of that chapter, Moses goes, he performs the signs, they see the signs, they believe. Now look at this part here, right here in Exodus, I think later on, maybe chapter 7, I don't have the verse here. Yeah, Exodus 7. When Pharaoh says to you, this is God to Moses, prove yourselves by working a miracle, you shall say to Aaron, faith doesn't come by proof. You can't argue people into the kingdom. This is the thing I hear when I put the microphone in people's face. Faith and proof don't go together. Not according to God, though. According to God, prove. When he says prove it, you shall say, okay, I'll prove it. Now, here's the thing. When I was a young lad in Hebrew school, I was very unconvinced by this. I thought, you're the God of the universe? You're taking a staff and throwing it on the floor and it turns into a snake? Don't you have better tricks up your sleeve? They get bigger, don't they? They grow. And they turn into the plagues. This is the understated note. The beginning of the symphony that grows into this grand crescendo that turns into the parting of the Red Sea and all the plagues of Egypt and the Mount Sinai. And if the people really were there, they saw with their eyes the truths of these things. But notice what it says right down here. You shall go to Pharaoh, and you shall say, the Lord your God sent me to you, saying, let my people go. By this you shall know. It's the same thing that Jesus said in the house with the healing of the paralytic. You shall know. It's knowledge. It's not this sort of inner speculation, this experiential thing. It's knowledge. We can know. And that, when you actually study this, it's all over the place. You just have to kind of retrain yourself, because a lot of the Christian culture, the contemporary Christian world has done the thinking for us. Think about this. Were there a lot of Christians in the Middle Ages? Yeah. Do they think like you? Their Christianity was a little different, wasn't it? Well, part of it was because that Christian world formed them that way. And we should always be challenging the world. If you disagree with the way they were practicing their Christianity, then you should also think about the way contemporary Christianity is affecting. This is why I encourage skepticism. A humble skepticism that doesn't have an agenda, but we have to be discerning. We have to be discerning. The simple man believes everything, says Proverbs 14. But the wise man gives thought to his steps. So we got to think things through. Test all things, Paul says. Test everything, but but you got to hold on to the good. All right, next one. Eusebius. This is a guy, some of you will be familiar with Eusebius. He wrote a book called, Ecclesiastical History, the early church history. He's around the time of Constantine. And he writes a great history of the church, but he also wrote a book called The Proof of the Gospel. In Latin, Demonstratio Evangelion. Impress your friends by using that, throwing that in a conversation. So Eusebius says, if so many things were proclaimed by the Hebrew divines, and if their fulfillment is so clear to us all today, who would not marvel at their inspiration? He's talking about fulfilled prophecy here. Who will not agree that their teaching and beliefs must be sure and true because of the extraordinary foreknowledge shown to the prophetic writers, and of the actual events that occurred in agreement with their prophecies? So there's a match between what the Old Testament prophet said and historical fulfillment, his actual history. And he says, a careful study of these matters should convince both Jews and Gentiles, basically all men, of the inspired and certain nature of the truths we hold. When's the last time you remember somebody giving this argument? When's the last time you remember anyone using this in a conversation with a non-Christian? He's saying that these are so clear when you look at the Old Testament prophecies and comparing them to actual history, that all men should be convinced of the inspired nature of our text, of the Bible. It should silence the tongues of false accusers who slander us by saying that we are unable logically to present a clear demonstration of the truths we hold, and that we think it's enough to retain those who come to us by faith alone. And as they say that we only teach our followers like irrational animals to shut their eyes and staunchly obey whatever we say without examination. So that's a caricature, he's saying. We're not like that. This is what our enemies are saying we're like. But when I go and I interview people on the street, they're often living caricatures of this. You know, they are like what the critics of Christianity were saying in the 4th century. And this isn't just a few. This is the overwhelming majority. The overwhelming majority of Christians that I interviewed were saying things like this, that faith is a blind leap. It's a feeling. It's not something you can argue. It's just not something you know intuitively in your heart. And it's not thought through. So, we need to think about it. Augustine said something similar. In his letter, one of his letters to the Manichaeans, he was a Manichaean, and that's a long historical theology conversation we don't need to get into here. But he says in this epistle, I call on the Manichaeans to admit the force of these evidences. Every reader can understand these words, he was led like a lamb to the slaughter. He's quoting Isaiah 53. And the whole of that plain prophecy, everybody can understand it. This is the thing that, again, I'm a non-Christian. I stumble onto these texts, I read them. I understood them. I said, how come nobody ever told me about this in my Jewish life? I heard about Jesus, but nobody ever said there was a Messiah or that Jesus might be him. And so I started asking questions. We have a whole poetical gospel in these words. They pierced my hands and feet and divided my garments among them. He's quoting Psalm 22. The blind may now even see the fulfillment of these words. All the ends of the earth shall worship before him. He's jumping to the end of Psalm 22, which I recommend that you do. It's a great little just exploration here. What happens at the end of Psalm 22? They pierced my. The whole psalm is. It starts off with my God, why have you forsaken me? Words that Jesus uses on the cross. There's piercing of hands and feet, but by the end of the psalm, all the nations are streaming to Zion. And this is what Augustine is pointing out. The apostles quoted the predictions, he says, of the prophets to prove the truth of their doctrines. Okay, so let's think about that too. Is that true? Did the apostles attempt to do this? Yeah, actually you see that a whole lot throughout the book of Acts. They're attempting to persuade and to reason with people in the synagogues. And that word proof even comes up, which we'll see. For although their preaching was accompanied with miracles, the miracles would have been ascribed to magic, as even now some venture to insinuate, since the testimony of prophets who lived so long before could not be ascribed to magical arts. So this is the thing. If you look at the Jewish critique of Christianity, it was Jesus is a magician and a sorcerer. They didn't deny his his wonder-working power, but they ascribed it to the dark side of the force. And if you look at some other non-Christians, Origen interacts with some of them, they also talk about him being a magician. But this thing here, with the fulfilled prophecy in the Holy Scriptures, showing that what the Messiah would do and how he would suffer and how his religion was, that was the anchor that sort of vindicated, protected them from that claim that this is just something demonic or sorcery. All right, now the Latin. Here's, I think I went too far. Let me go one more. All right, so the Oxford English Dictionary, some of you who've heard one of my shows where I did sort of the deep dive with the OED. We'll do a little bit of that here on this in this talk. The Oxford English Dictionary, apparently, it has a lot of depth. It's the most rigorous dictionary in the English language. And so, look, you don't have this in your home. This is like a multi-volume dictionary set, right? So I got the online edition. I started looking up faith, and some people were, if you listen to them, they will tell you that the OED can sort of give you the history of how this word evolved over time. So in addition to having good definitions, it also will give you citations of who used it when, what's the earliest example of this or that. And as with any word, like the word cell, depends on the usage, right? So, reach me on my cell. He's trapped in a cell. Look in your magnifying glass at that cell. There are different ways that we can use the word, so the context helps to define it. Well, the OED will list all these different kind of definitions. You have multiple definitions. And so here are some of the information we find in the OED. So the Latin root of faith is fides. So we get the word fidelity in the fidelity in marriage. You have to trust your partner. You even hear of financial institutions as fidelities, okay? Because trust is a huge part of that. The dog Fido is a faithful companion. That's how we get the name Fido. Some of you, if you're younger, you don't even know what that means. But when we were kids, there were a lot of cartoons with a guy named Fido. So the word in English is trust, guarantee, promise, assurance, fulfillment of a promise, proof. What? Proof is even in here. Confirmation, authoritativeness, credit, honest, loyalty, allegiance, credibility, trustworthiness, reliability, belief, conviction, confidence. These are not typically what people associate with faith today. Because faith is more of that unsure. Yeah, I just gotta have faith, even though I don't know. And they mostly mean hope, but it's a different thing. The ancient Greek, it says, pistis has a similar range of senses. And so as I looked through Aristotle and Strabo and a whole bunch of writers, they were saying exactly what I'm finding in the OED. Here are some of the other definitions. Attestation, confirmation, assurance to attest, to affirm, confirm, to give surety. Power to convince, credibility, credit, convincing authority. Firm trust or belief in reliance upon something, the truth of a doctrine, the ability of goodness of a person, the efficacy or worth of a thing. Confidence, credence. Now this is my favorite one. Belief based on evidence, testimony, and authority. Now if we go back to the very beginning, we find that these some skeptics, like Richard Dawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson, define faith as believing in something in the absence of evidence. And yet the OED is saying that belief based on evidence, not the absence of evidence, is the meaning of this word. So the popular definition has changed. In English, it used, not that long ago, it used to mean belief based on evidence, testimony, or authority. Now, again, I didn't go asking people at the shopping mall. I went to Christian music events, mega churches, and conventions. And I got the atheist definition of faith. Not the OED version of faith. That's a problem. All right. Now here's the thing. Belief in the absence of evidence is the definition for blind faith. But the blind is the key modifier. So why would you need to add the word blind to faith if faith already meant believe in the absence of evidence? No one would ever need to put blind. That would be totally redundant. Now, the first use of blind faith we find in 1529. That's probably Thomas More. And he talks about blind faith in blind images. But it's a negation, it's a critique. Blind faith, so faith without evidence. George Eliot, in her book in 1863, talks about someone accepting, she snaps and has a moment of blind faith. Leap of faith, too. Someone in 1854 has the boldest leap of faith. So I started looking, raise your hand if you're familiar with the Google Ngram. Ooh, I'll get to show you something fun. Google Ngram is a tool that you can use, and you can put in words and phrases that show how these words and phrases have grown in importance over time, as it's evaluating them in the how all the scanned books that they've put in their reference library, in their online database. So it's going to be looking at all their periodicals and books that they've scanned over the years. And so I put in blind faith and leap of faith, and look what happens when you do these two words. They start getting really popular in the 1920s and 40s. And blind faith a little earlier, 1800s. So these are relatively recent. There's just a change. This helps to show the change over time in the popularity of these ideas. They weren't as popular, but then they became popular. So English changes. Now what's happening is, because these concepts got popular, then we started misunderstanding what faith itself was. Language evolves. We need to just come on board and say, yes, it does evolve. Most people think one way when they hear the word faith. They probably think the same way you think when you hear about somebody else's faith, right? When you hear that somebody is a faithful Muslim, what do you think that means? It probably means, well, they were raised that way. It's just something that it's family tradition. It may be, if they're a faithful Mormon, it may be experiential, you don't know. So that's the way people are, whatever you think of other religionists, that's the way people are probably thinking of you. And especially as we get more secular, then faith turns into this sort of darker thing, where people become suspicious of you if you have faith. So here are some things I would like us to think about. We should contrast what faith is with what it isn't. This is, synonyms and antonyms. Okay, faith is not wishing. It's a great book on this topic by Greg Koval if you're interested. Faith is not wishing. Paul has a very good word for this. It's ophalon. When I taught Greek at a classical school for a year, I used to teach using words that like ploion. It's the word for boat. And so to get young 14-year-olds who are not interested in Greek to memorize this word, I'd say, okay, you're on a boat, and you put the worm on a hook. It's a ploy. It's a ploy on the water. It's a ploy on the water. You're in a boat. Remember that. This one here, ophalon. Ophalon my rear end. I wish that the horse wouldn't have run off too fast. All right, anyway. Ophalon is the word, it's an awful joke. Okay, so I wish those people who unsettled you would go the whole way and cut themselves off. But it's a wish. And that's a perfectly good word for wishing, but it's not the word he chose or anybody chose in the New Testament for faith. The word for faith is pistuo, which is more of that confidence, credibility, rooted in inherent worth. Just as a person must not suppose that he would receive anything, James says, this is a word that people think, supposition. He just supposes, he just wishes, he just thinks. Just thinking, supposing, hoping. Here's another one, hope. These are all good words that could have been used. I hope to see you as I go to Spain. They were not chosen for faith. Paul warns of those who devote themselves to myths and genealogies which promote speculations. That was not the word. I think that word may be related to our English word ecstasy. These are not the words that were chosen for our word. So we can see what it means when you look at how Paul and Aristotle and Strabo and others use it, and the way the lexicographers define it, and then you can see what other words they had at their disposal. But here's the key idea that we should think about, why is blind faith so popular among Christians today? In that Jesus says clearly that blind faith is a bad idea. If the blind lead the blind, Both will fall into a pit. It's a dangerous thing to have blind faith. Blind faith in your leader can be very destructive and dangerous, says Jesus. So this is something we need to think about as we evaluate what we mean by faith. Now, here is, I think, part of our problem. Hebrews 11 is when I stepped back and listened to the answers I was getting at Christian conventions, I would say, what do you think faith is? I'm doing a podcast, I'm looking for people to help me. What do you think faith is? And it's a blind leap. And sometimes they would give me a Bible verse. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And it's right here from the King James Version of Hebrews 11:1. In the ESV, it's faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. But the King James is what people seem to memorize of a lot of the events that I went to. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. Now the question is, what does this mean? And here's what I'm convinced of. I think people misinterpret this verse to mean that faith is blind. It's a blind leap. And that faith is the same as hope. Faith is the substance of things hoped for. So faith and hope are just identical. And that faith doesn't look to external evidence because it's the evidence of things not seen. Faith itself is evidence. Now, based on the way it reads in some English translations, you can see the plausibility of how people could get there. And what I would like to do in this lecture is to help you to see that that's not a good interpretation of Hebrews 11:1. So we'll start by taking a look at this lexicon here. This is a lexicon by C.S. Speak, and it's a very interesting lexicon. But he says this: in the ancient world, as well as the present, all owners of buildings and land were required to have deeds on record establishing their property rights. Thus, the hypostasis, which is the word that's translated there, the assurance or the substance of things, the substance. A hypostasis was a collection of documentary evidence establishing ownership deposited in the archives and proving the owner's rights. Hence, it's a guarantee for the future. So the property rights guarantees your inheritance. Faith is the title deed of things hoped for, he says. Faith is the title deed of things hoped for. Now, another lexicon, this one I've used before, the BDAG. This sense of confidence or assurance, which was favored by Melanchthon, Luther, Tyndale, and others, for Hebrews 11:1, has enjoyed a lot of favor, but it has to be eliminated, these writers say, since examples of it can't be found. Now, if you look back one page, that is the way that the ESV is using it. Faith is the assurance. And this lexicon is saying that we can't really see that word hypostasis, which is this word here. Assurance, hypostasis. That word is not assurance according to this lexicon. It doesn't like that. It's part of the problem. See, the thing is, a lot of Bible translations want to keep like one foot in the past. There's a tradition, and there are a lot of favorite Bible verses, and when you change it too much, it drops. Sales drop, right? And there are records of this kind of thing happening. So sometimes when they're making a translation, it's not only about the way the Greek is translated. It's more about sometimes the sales are involved. All right. So it says, this has enjoyed much favor, but it must be eliminated since examples cannot be found. This lexicon therefore renders hypostasis as, quote, a guarantee of ownership, entitlement, title deed. It also defined the word elenkos as evidence for truth of something, such as the facts upon which a person is convinced. So this is the other word here. Faith is conviction. So faith is the hypostasis and of things hoped for, and the conviction or elenkos of things unseen. And that other word was evidence of truth for something, such as the facts upon which a person can be convicted. All right. So when you put all this together, I think this is the best translation here. The SRV, which is the Shane Rosenthal version. Now, I only have one verse so far, so be patient. This is my translation here. Faith is the title deed of things hoped for. It's documentary evidence of unseen things. Okay? Now, the question is, what are the unseen things? Like, apply this in a non-religious context. So, you have faith in a babysitter. You have faith in a financial advisor. What are the unseen things related to the financial advisor? Well, it's the future. Is it going to make me money 5 or 10 years for retirement or not? It's future. Okay? But you have a basis for that hope. Right? Hebrews 13, I think, helps us to see what the context is here. All these people died in faith. Think about Hebrews 11 is all about this hall of faith. All these people died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. They desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. So what is the unseen thing in Hebrews 11? The unseen thing is the future heavenly inheritance. So if you have faith today, you have the documentary evidence of your future heavenly reward. So here's, I think, where people go wrong. They think that, let me use some technical jargon, then I'll unpack it. They think this is epistemology, and it's not, it's soteriology. They think faith is a way of knowing, the sixth sense. It's something like, it's not defining faith itself. It's defining how you get to heaven. Faith is your ticket, it's your title deed to heaven. So it's an aspect of faith rather than defining the mechanics of faith itself. And it's not saying faith is a way of knowing. It's just saying that it's not saying that faith is something you do apart from the senses. No, because as we've seen, it's evidential reasoning is part of that. Documentary evidence requires rational looking and seeing and evaluating. It's simply affirming that all you need to get to heaven is faith. That is if you have faith today, you can have assurance, confidence, that you have your eternal reward. That's what Hebrews 11 is saying. And obviously, there's a sense in which faith is unseen, because you can't see what your babysitter's doing while you're at the restaurant. You can't see what your financial advisor is doing, but it's not apart from evidence. So sometimes faith is by hearing, not seeing. We don't see. This is, I think, Thomas's problem, wasn't it? Thomas refused to trust with his ear what all of the other apostles were saying. And yet, faith for him did come by seeing. And so when people say faith is blind, you should say, well, what about Thomas? For him, it seemed like it was by seeing and touching. Or how about the Apostle John? That which we have seen with our eyes and touched with our hands, this we proclaim to you, that you may have life. In fact, he doesn't say seen in a vision, seen with our eyes, touched with our hands, very tactile. That which you've heard. And that's the thing that you find everywhere in the New Testament. That sort of eyewitness report grounded in reality. I think that's the last slide. All right. So, this is my hypothesis. We have sort of gone off the rails down this path where we are now similar to all the other religionists, all the other sort of those competing in the marketplace of faith. We don't have anything distinctive. Whereas if you look at the quotes from Augustine and Eusebius and others, they were saying these things are fair. All men should be convinced of the truth of our faith because of the reality of these things. What does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 15? If these things didn't really happen, these things, which is Christ's death, burial, resurrection, if it didn't happen, we are all meant to be pitied. Our faith is in vain. It has to be true for us to believe it. And what we're saying is that this faith is something that everyone should believe if it is true, and no one should believe if it's not. It's a truth claim that relates to the real world. It's not something that you apply like it's not like a diet program. It's not like this life change, give Jesus a try. That's the way we've been marketing this for so many years, partly because it's been low-hanging fruit. When churches have marketed the faith this way, it's gotten, people respond. Because people have been respecting Jesus for so long that, and you know what, when you do apply a little Jesus, sometimes it will improve things. Sometimes Buddhism will improve things too, because people who are drug addicts wasted and any kind of, you add a different system and it may clean up your life. Well, does a cleaned up life equal the right religion? There are a lot of cleaned up lives out there. A lot of people who have gone from being abusers and gamblers and alcoholics by applying Scientology. Doesn't make it true. All the faiths in the world can't be true. So, we need to regain, especially in this increasing secular culture, we need to regain our confidence that this is true and not be afraid of the question. Should we question our faith? Questioning our faith isn't a problem at all in Christianity. In fact, we are encouraged to do so. Do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are of God. For there are many false prophets out there, which I think means we should be skeptical, especially when you see what's out there online and in a lot of our churches and on TV. So that's the presentation for tonight. Let's open it up for questions.
Keep it rolling. Keep those
Live stream.
Thank you. I don't want to let everyone go just yet because I think we might have some questions right now for our speaker. And I want to introduce to everyone Reverend Christopher Neiswanger. He's the chief thinker of the Memphis Apologetics Group.
There we go. And we want to ask some questions of our speaker, how he brought us from a typical misunderstanding of faith, and then started talking about how faith is very essential to salvation. So it was a really far-reaching presentation. So I'm going to turn this microphone over to Chris. He's going to ask some questions. If you have questions and you want to submit them, I'll be right here. You can hand them to me, or in a moment you can stand up and ask a question about the presentation. My first question is what English word has more definitions than any other English word?
Ooh, that's a good question. The word the?
It's the word set.
S-E-T. Okay. Well, now we're set.
Yes.
Which number is that one? Do you know? Wait, I just use it there.
I'll just start off with this.
All right.
Thank you so much for being here. I've been listening to you on the radio for 25, might even be 30 years. I don't know if you're old enough for it to be 30 years.
Well, I was the behind-the-scene guys in the early days of KKLA, and so I was sort of the guy who was playing the music, and it was only until 2019 when I became the host,
Right.
stepping out, and then, but now I'm stepping in. I have total creative freedom to do what I want to do with the Humble Skeptic. So I actually was pitching this kind of an idea some years ago, and they're like, yeah, great, that sounds like we should do that, but we just never did it, so now I'm doing it.
Sure. One of the things that I love about what you're talking about is in contemporary culture, especially within Christianity, we're veering away from the historicity of the faith.
Your microphone's not on.
We're veering away from the historicity of the faith, which can be very dangerous for us. Because of all of the religions out there, ours is deeply embedded in history. In other words, we believe that actual things happen to actual people in an actual place, and it's written down in our books. But is there a difference? I remember I was listening to White Horse Inn a long time ago, and it might have been you and Michael Horton or some of those guys, and they said knowledge, assent, and trust. Notitia, assensus, and fiducia.
Yeah.
But what aspect of that is knowledge? Is it some kind of special Holy Ghost knowledge? Or is it ordinary knowledge of knowing what it is that you're weighing and deciding whether or not you believe?
Very good questions. So, there are a lot of different ways I could approach this. First of all, history and faith go together. If you think about, if you're in a church that occasionally quotes the Apostles' Creed, suffered under Pontius Pilate. It's a weird thing to throw in a creed about spiritual things, but that's the heart of our faith, that this is, at one point in history, certain things happened to the one we claim is the God-man who interrupted history and became a man, suffered, buried, died, buried, suffered under Pontius Pilate. So it's a historical religion. This is something that people like B.B. Warfield and others said, that this is an unusual kind of dogma, an unusual religion that has not just a principle, yin is an equal force of yang. When did that happen in history?
Right?
Well, that's a different category. No, history isn't part of that. It's just a principle. So this makes a historical claim, and it says if these things didn't happen, then we're all most to be pitied. So it's history and faith go together. There's a long sort of march of redemptive history. God revealing himself over time, making these promises, and it starts with the Abrahamic promise. Actually starts in the Garden of Eden with Genesis 3:16, the first announcement. So these promises grow over time, and they're amazing in terms of their fulfillment with all the different things that Jesus does. But this is just look at the book of Acts. If you look at the book of Acts, what they're doing, city after city, they're talking about what they saw with their eyes and how it matched and fulfilled the historical prophecies. Now, your definition of faith as knowledge, assent, and trust is the classic definition from across the spectrum of the ages. So you can't, and this isn't just a spiritual thing, this is something that, again, applies to the financial advisor, the babysitter, your doctor. You can't have faith in something you know nothing about. Nobody here would go to, if you get a homeopathic remedy that somebody gives you, you just meet them and they're, oh, I have a perfect cure for that, and they give you this packet of something. You might look up the ingredients instead of just having the faith. But the doctor, when he gives you something, I had this happen once. I had a doctor give me Icosapine because I had something going on with my gut. And he said, I think your gut, things are squeezing the wrong times. This will solve it. Didn't solve it. So I had the knowledge and I had the trust, so much so that I swallowed the medicine. And it didn't solve my problem. So we have to have the knowledge and the assent and the trust. The assent part is I know that it's true. So I have knowledge. You can know something out there. I know that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon. Do I know that it's true, the Book of Mormon? I don't know that it's true, but I know that he's involved with it. But then there's the trusting your soul to the information you find in that book. Okay? And this is where we say, no, we don't want to make that leap of faith because it's not true. Well, in my case, I went to a different doctor and I got a different result. This other doctor gave me more tests. Turned out that I had a bad gallbladder, and when I had that taken away, when my gallbladder was removed, my pain went away. So I had knowledge, assent, and trust in that second doctor, and he was able to solve that problem. But so what my faith is involved in that. If I didn't trust the second doctor, I wouldn't have had my pain cured. So faith is involved, but faith has to be connected with the objective reality. Because my faith was involved the first time, it just didn't cure my problem because it wasn't the right diagnosis. Knowledge, assent, and trust, I think, is a great way to think about faith. And trust is the operative idea. We trust the one in whom we have good reason to believe. We're trusting the one we have good reason to believe. It's not that leap that gets us across. It's we have really good evidence. And my second doctor showed me, I did a scan, and when you took that sort of radioactive fluid, I could see your gallbladder was improperly functioning. I said, I trust you. Mm-hmm. And it worked.
When I was very young in the faith, I sat under a pastor who told me that it doesn't really matter if Jesus rose from the dead in Jerusalem, as long as he rose from the dead in our hearts. What's wrong with that kind of an analysis of Scripture?
So that view has sort of been the kind of liberal justification for experiential religion that was very popular about 100 years ago, and then it kind of slowly drifted away. You don't hear a lot of people saying that anymore, but there are some who still use that. And basically the idea of the resurrection in your heart, if you if you think about the language of the New Testament, where they are, put your hand in my side kind of thing, that how do you make sense of that? It doesn't match up with the biblical narrative. Secondly, there are a lot of experiential religions. The Mormon claim is just another one that comes easy to mind. How do you negotiate the experience of Jesus arising in your heart with other people who have other religions? Often, in fact, one thing that I did recently in my street interviews is I would ask, okay, so you say you have a feeling, you know it's true because of your feelings, you've had the experience, so what do you do with the Hindu and the Muslim? And often they'll say, I know that is tricky because I had conversations with my Hindu roommate at college, and they always kind of said, yeah, that's neat for you, but they admit it's not convincing. Your experience, it's hard for somebody else to get into your experience. It's just that they can't get inside your heart and feel your feelings. And they know a lot of people around the world have religious experiences, and they just think, how great for you.
One of the questions from one of our attendees, how do you distinguish between faith that is understanding the facts, knowledge of the gospel, versus saving faith?
So understanding faith is a crucial component of faith, but it's not the same thing as actual saving faith. You can have complete knowledge of what it takes to be saved. You could be a New Testament scholar and understand the words of Jesus, but not put your trust to that one you're studying. So knowledge is one component. It's kind of like knowing. If I went to the second doctor who did all the scans, and I said, okay, thank you, I believe you, I know that this is a good theory, I don't want to do the surgery. I haven't gone to that next step of trusting myself to his care. Or getting on an airplane. You can trust the airline is safe, but because of certain issues you have with fear of flying, you say, I can't get on the plane. So it's not a rational thing. But you know it's true, but you don't trust. And so that would be the difference. So there are a lot of people who are like this. They know a lot, but they don't actually trust and live in the reality of that trust.
The Eusebius slide has a use of faith alone, which seems to be the blind faith version of the use of the word. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, when Eusebius is using the word faith alone, or the phrase faith alone, he's not meaning it in the same way that Luther is meaning faith alone. Faith alone is a sola fide, is an article of the Reformation that we should celebrate. But when Luther is using the phrase, he's talking about faith is the only thing that saves, as opposed to works and things like that. So Eusebius is talking about faith by itself apart from evidence. It's closer to epistemology, not soteriology, to use the fancy theological language. It's closer to just that sort of blind leap. Faith by itself apart from the evidences that it's like, why do you trust? This is a question I've asked a lot of people on the street. Why this particular leap here? That stymies people. They don't know that's a good question. I'll think about that. They don't know why they make this particular leap unless it was something internal. Always internal. And in the New Testament, it's never internal. Faith is looking external, outside, looking to the object of our faith, looking to Jesus, looking to what he has done. Who is this man who was seen by the eyewitnesses and foreseen by the prophets?
Some troublemaker gave me this one. What evidence do you have that I should believe in evidence?
Well, one of my favorite philosophers is a guy named Thomas Reid, who has common sense philosophy. And one of the things he will say is, like, you can ask questions to the point where it's like, well, why do you believe that? And you say, well, okay, and then you give an argument. Why do you believe that? I give an argument. Why do you believe that? And at some point, you're going to get to the place where you say, I don't know, I just believe. And he calls these, like, these first principles. Aristotle talked about this too, and others. You get to these first principles, I just believe that my mind works reasonably. I just believe that my senses are accurately attending and receiving the world. I just believe that other people exist and that I'm not in a coma having a hallucination. And I can't really give you good evidence, or give good reason why, but what I could do is give you an argument why you should not do the opposite. Like, you don't have to give a person an argument to why you should move your head when I throw a rock toward it. It's just instinctive, right? So the seeing the rock coming toward my head, I don't have to sort of think, is evidence real? Is the rock real? You just go, if you're quick. So I think we're born testing and trusting, and it's common sense. And part of our problem, and so there is faith related to that. So faith is related to that. I just think this is one of the reasons I'm a Christian. Because I think the only way that you can anchor that faith is by having a God who made the mind reasonably, the senses reasonably. He anchors all that. And he's also appeared in history. Does that answer your question? There was a hand way back there. Go ahead and just shout your question out.
Well, and to address the question that was raised, doesn't Jesus say to John's disciples, when John is in the hands of Herod in the pit, doesn't he not say to them, the blind see, the lame are healed, the gospel is preached to the poor, the dead are raised? Doesn't he appear to evidence? His own appear?
Yes, I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow. My first talk is on dealing with doubt, and that's the focus of that very passage. So I'm not going to belabor that, or else I'll do my whole talk in advance. But yes, he does. He focuses on a lot of evidence there. It's a good passage. Remember, it's from Luke chapter 7. And John the Baptist, it's a fascinating passage. We'll explore deeply. Jeremy.
Hey, Shane. This is a risky question because
I like those.
I want to be as fair as I can be to Richard Dawkins. I'm curious to know what you think about this. Is it more likely that Dawkins is not getting his definition of faith from the dictionary? Is it more likely that he's actually getting this definition of faith the same way that you were getting it from these interviews with Christians? I bet that he's had a lot of conversations with religious people that led him to conclude that this is how religious people define faith. What do you think about that?
I definitely think there's a reason in which people like Richard Dawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson are coming up with this definition for faith. Faith is believing something in the absence of evidence. There's a reason for that. And it's not because they're not looking at dictionaries. Well, how should we define this? They're just going with what they've heard. Exactly right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of religions that are not Christian will certainly have this. And so this is where I say, here's what I recommend. Give the word faith to all the other religionists. And use the word trust. That's my recommendation. Yes?
We live in a different time than the Bible happened. So what does archaeology play in our faith? Should it play a major part?
Well, archaeology would be one of those ways of seeing and evaluating and testing whether or not your faith, your views, are actually mirroring reality. Are they grounded in reality? So archaeology, in my view, is a tremendously important thing. We'll be talking about some archaeological finds in some of my talks over this weekend. Because I think that is a good way to keep double checking. Like, the person who says, I just know in my heart, I feel it, that it's true, doesn't have to bother with archaeology. They don't. They don't have to bother with apologetics or arguments. They just, they went to this worship thing and they had a great experience, and now they just, it's great until it stops working. And often it doesn't work forever because there's no root there. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are leaving the faith.
This next question is a great question that maybe we could wrap on for the night. And I'm going to make an addendum on it.
There's one more question over there we should do before we, or I mean after this.
Would you take a couple of minutes to give us your life story? And I'll throw on to that, if you could fit in your dad and Billy Joel, that would be awesome.
Life story in a couple of minutes. Okay, well, let me do the. I was bar mitzvahed at age 13. Now think about this. If you remember your youth, I was a couple times a week having to go to school again in the evenings to study Hebrew. And nobody ever tried to make it exciting. Nobody ever tried to say, we're going to have a great groovy time with pizza and fun games. It was just, learning a foreign language, not really understanding why. That tradition was definitely forcing upon the next generation. But you know what? They've done a pretty good job over the years, over the centuries, of passing on the faith to the next generation. Anyway, so I was raised in a community that didn't really believe a lot of theology. It was more of a cultural and ethnic Judaism. And as I mentioned, I was an atheist by the 3rd grade. I did ask, questions along the way, like, why am I cleaning the yard on a Saturday? And, we want to be able to enjoy it the whole weekend. I realized pretty quickly that religion wasn't terribly important. And when I discovered the texts, and it was mostly just not by going places and seeing various experiences, mostly by just curiosity, discovering the text of the Old Testament. Micah 5:2 was very influential to me. Out of Bethlehem shall come the one who is the ruler of old, whose origins are from everlasting. I saw the Christmas specials. I said, okay, well, that's weird. So the Jesus story is here in my Jewish text. But what I was really confused about when I started reading the Gospels for myself, like, where's the part about the little drummer boy? Because it's like, my version of the Jesus story was from the cartoons that I watched as a kid, right? So, but after talking to one rabbi I talked to, I said, okay, Psalm 22, they pierced my hands and my feet. What do you do with that? Doesn't it sound like crucifixion? He said, I don't know. Maybe it's bows and arrows. That's what he said. He gave me a good book to read that, it's called Faith Strengthened by Isaac Trokey, I think, and challenged me to think about, were the New Testament writers really making up prophecies, or was it real? And I couldn't answer a lot of the questions until maybe 15 or 20 years later, some of them. But there was enough there that made me say, I'm going to become a Christian, I think. And it caused conflicts with family members and friends, and but that was 1985. And so, how long ago is that now? A long time ago. Almost 40 years going. All right, now the other was Billy Joel. So the first episode of my podcast is my dad told a story in passing about seeing Billy Joel at a piano bar. And after processing, it was just in passing. Now, I had never heard him tell the story before. And he mentions it in passing, but I started wondering, you were there when he was doing Piano Man. He writes a song about that. Do you know any of the characters, like Davy in the Navy and Paul the real estate novelist and John the bartender? Do you know? Maybe he is one of the characters. Maybe my dad is one of the businessmen who drank too much and talked to the waitresses about politics. And so I decided to interview him and talk this. My brother is like, this can't be. This doesn't work, actually. If you look at Wikipedia, it shows that he did Piano Man in '73, and we were in West Virginia at the time. So the whole podcast was to show my brother was wrong. Okay? You guys have, you get it, right? So basically, no, it's why do we trust information that we hear? And it's that doing the deeper dive, going a little deeper than average to see how do we get to the truth. And my whole story sort of investigates that story. What can I know about my own family and about the Billy Joel story, and tracing it down? And it's investigative and fun. So that's the pilot episode if you're interested in listening to the Billy Joel story. There was a question over here before we wrap up.
Well, you mentioned Moses, and my question to you is, and I've never heard your podcast, but do you believe he was an actual historical figure?
Yes, I do.
The Torah?
Yeah.
Now, there are a lot of people like Bert Ehrman, I'm sure you've heard of him. Now, these
Oh, yeah.
people are like agnostics, the people that teach in some of these seminaries. And they would say, well, actually, the Hebrew Bible was like written up by a committee, there wasn't a Moses, but there were people that were bringing this material, and it wasn't compiled or edited until the Babylonian captivity.
Yep. It's called JEDP theory.
Right, now how would you respond to that?
Well, we'll be talking about that this weekend. There was actually I'll give a hint of one of the talks. There's a recent discovery of a curse tablet on Mount Ebal in Israel, where it's basically the area where Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman there in Shechem. And this is the same area that Joshua had this huge sort of blessing and cursing ceremony there in the early days when they were entering the Promised Land. And on the top of, there's an altar mentioned that would be in Mount Ebal, the mountain of curse. And they recently found a curse tablet that has very, very old Proto-Sinaitic language in it. And this very, very old Proto-Sinaitic, fancy word, the oldest alphabetic language we have. And it mentions the word El, and also the name Yahweh, or Yehu, the oldest form of Yahweh. And those two aren't supposed to, those are supposed to be two different traditions, right? In the JEDP theory. You're supposed to have El as this other God, and then Yahweh, and then it's the merging and the synthesizing of that information. Well, here we find it in one document, and it's in the oldest script that looks like Hebrew is the oldest alphabetic script. That announcement was made just this last March, and the peer-reviewed study of it is about to be released any time now. But I'll show you the tablet if you come tomorrow. I've got a slide where it shows a little bit of that. So that's just one short answer. The other thing is the Bart Ehrman agnostic speculative world. It's hard when you go back to the Moses period because it's so long ago and it's hard to find evidence. But part of it relates to the way we have bad chronologies, and we're looking in things with, part of it relates to our assumptions about the chronology. And one of the guys that I've interviewed in the White Horse Inn world is David Roll, who he's got a new paradigm for the chronology. And when you look for things according to his view, with the rethinking the Egyptian chronology, he finds a lot of evidence for Semitic people in Egypt, and he's not a Christian. And he's finding stuff that is amazing in terms of the way it looks. And so he argues that Moses and Jacob and all these people were real historical individuals. He just doesn't adopt the theology, but he does believe that they were historical characters, and that that Hebrew was around the time, and they were able to to do the kinds of things that are described in the Bible. And if it didn't happen, we shouldn't be Christian. We shouldn't, because Jesus is, following. He talks about Moses, and Moses wrote of me. And if Moses never existed, if that's a myth, then the whole foundation of it's a myth.
Well, speaking of that, in the current Jewish community, I listen to Dennis Prager a lot. He's very influential. He speaks about God all the time. He has a podcast. He's interviewed by a lot of Christian personalities like Eric Metaxas and people like that. What would his view of Jesus be? I know he's never asked that, but what is the current prevailing belief about Jesus among the were you raised Orthodox?
I was raised in conservative and reformed, so which is very
He
secular.
was not a good person. He was a deceiver. I've heard that.
There are a lot of people in the Jewish community will say that Jesus is a kind of a blasphemer, heretic, but that's if you're really theological. Typically, a lot of Jews in this country, the more secular you are, Judaism is more of a culture rather than a theology. So it's kind of similar to Catholicism, and a lot of Catholicism is more, I don't really read the text. I have these sort of Latin liturgies that I go to. Probably not Latin mostly anymore. But it's more of a culture than it is a heartfelt theology. And so a lot of contemporary Jews have no problem saying, yeah, Jesus was nice. We disagree with some of the things he said, but, you know, he's a good guy. But they definitely don't want to ascribe to him divinity or anything like that.
Well, how would you describe the Trinity to a Jewish person? I know in the Shema it says you believe in one God, love him with all your heart, and that's like a prayer in the Jewish community. They, you know, they pray a couple of times a day. So squaring that oneness of
So
God.
we'll wrap it up with
one
this.
God
This is a
three
great
persons.
question, and I think there's a lot we could say. The new contemporary New Testament scholarship is really abandoning the bad theology of the last 200 years, which was in some ways anti-Jewish. I mean, think about German higher criticism. That was the same area that invented Nazism. New Testament scholarship is having a revival right now, understanding the Jewish roots. And there's a scholar that I'll be talking about tomorrow named Daniel Boyarin, University of Berkeley professor, Talmud scholar. And he wrote a book called The Jewish Gospels. He talks about this very thing. The Trinity is not an innovation. He says there were people before the time of Jesus coming up with, looking at the Jewish texts, finding very interesting passages where there are two different Yahwehs in the same verse. And when John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, that's a very solidly Jewish idea. It's not a Greek idea, he says. It's a very Jewish idea. And that the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's unity, but also diversity. That view was very common in Judaism before Christianity. And sometimes it's called the two powers of heaven. And there are a lot of fascinating texts that you have. Well, I mean, just the one we mentioned today, the burning bush. And I'll close with this. The burning bush, it doesn't say that Moses appeared before God. It says that he appeared before the angel of the Lord. It's the better than angel is messenger, maybe even better, the ambassador. It's the one who speaks on behalf of, in a regal kind of way. But he also then speaks as Yahweh. He's the messenger sent by Yahweh who also happens to be Yahweh. There are a lot of texts like that in the Old Testament. A lot of them. And the more New Testament scholars sort of redig. In fact, if you look at the earliest Christian apologetics works, they were mostly on these kinds of topics. Understanding like how God had revealed himself over time, and looking at here we find the Trinity in these Old Testament texts from Genesis. And there is a lot for us to go back and reinvestigate our own texts and to understand them better.
Thank you so much, Shane. Really enjoyed that. So tomorrow is a very long day. Please come to as much as you can. We begin here with 8 o'clock in the morning with breakfast, and then presentations throughout the day. We'll have lunch here on the campus. No formal presentations at lunch, but a time for you to meet with Shane, Chris, Jeremy Smith.
Yes, sir.
Yes, nice to see you. Jeremy will be making a presentation for us tomorrow as well, and then into the evening. So I hope you were blessed by this, and that you will have an opportunity to see you tomorrow. Any other closing announcements I need to make? Please devour the food on your way out. And let me give you a threefold benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord lift up his face upon you and be merciful to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Amen. Thank you for being here.